Hello, and welcome to Barcast Audio. This is our Contracts Face Punch Essay Workshop. This workshop is designed to help walk you through a contracts essay. For our example, we're going to be walking through the July 2014 MEE Contracts Essay. You can easily access this essay on the NCBE website or by Googling July 2014 MEE questions. I'll begin by reading the question. Take special care to note to yourself any issues and facts that stick out to you as I'm reading. I'd suggest you rewind and listen through the question twice before attempting to tackle it. All right, without further ado, let's get started. A music conservatory has two concert halls. One concert hall had a pipe organ that was in poor repair, and the other had no organ. The conservatory decided to repair the existing organ and buy a new organ for the other concert hall. After some negotiation, the conservatory entered into two contracts with a business that both repairs and sells organs. Under contract one, the business agreed to repair the existing pipe organ for the conservatory for $100,000. The business would usually charge a higher price for a project of this magnitude, but the business agreed to this price because the conservatory agreed to prepay the entire amount. Under the other contract, the business agreed to sell a new organ to the conservatory for the other concert hall for $225,000. As with the repair contract, the business agreed to a low sales price because the conservatory agreed to prepay the entire amount. Both contracts were signed on January 3rd, and the conservatory paid the business a total of $325,000 that day. 2 weeks later, before the business had commenced repair of the existing organ, the business suffered serious and unanticipated financial reversals. The chief financial officer for the business contacted the conservatory and said, "Bad news. We had an unexpected liability, and as a result are in a real cash crunch. In fact, even though we haven't acquired the new organ from our supplier or started repair on your existing organ, we've already spent the cash you gave us, and we have no free cash on hand. We're really sorry, but we're in a fix. I think that maybe we can find a way to perform both contracts, but not at the original prices. If you agree to pay $60,000 more for the repair and $40,000 more for the new organ, we can probably find financing to finish everything. If you don't agree to pay us the extra money, I doubt that we will ever be able to perform either contract, and you'll be out the money you already paid us." After receiving this unwelcome news, the conservatory agreed to pay the extra amounts, provided that the extra amount on each contract would be paid upon completion of the business's obligations under that contract. The business agreed to this arrangement, and the parties quickly signed documents reflecting these changes to each contract. The business then repaired the existing organ and delivered the new organ and demanded payment of the additional $100,000. The conservatory now has refused to pay the business the additional amounts for the repair and the new organ. Question 1. Must the conservatory pay the additional $60,000 for the organ repair? Explain. Question 2. Must the conservatory pay the additional $40,000 for the new organ? Explain. All right. Now that we've read through this essay, which issue stuck out to you? Take a moment and try to think what the issues were. I'd suggest you go back and listen to the hypo again, just to get in the practice of identifying these issues as you're reading through the fact pattern. The first fact that should have jumped out to you is the line about the conservatory entering into two different contracts. Once you see that a contract has been formed, before you think about anything else, your first job is to identify whether it is a contract for goods or services. If it is a service contract, that means we're going to be applying either the common law in MEE jurisdictions or state contract law in state-specific jurisdictions. If, alternatively, it's a sale of goods contract, we're going to apply the UCC. Be sure to include a quick rule explaining the difference between the UCC and common law, and whether they do or do not apply at the top of your essay. This brief mention can help net you a few easy points at the start of any contracts essay. So here, the conservatory has entered into two contracts, one for organ repairs and another for a new organ. That means we're going to be dealing with common law principles for the repairs because it's a service contract, and UCC principles for the new organ contract because an organ is a good. Moving on, The facts here talk about the business suffering serious and unanticipated financial reversals, prompting the business's CFO to pen this letter to the conservatory, expressing doubt as to their ability to perform in accordance with the terms of their initial agreement. But the CFO doesn't stop there. He tells the conservatory that the company may be able to perform both contracts, but only if the conservatory ponies up $60,000 more for the repair and $40,000 more for the new organ. The next fact that I want you to key in on is that the conservatory agreed to pay the extra prices to the business, provided that they would be paid upon completion. I can tell you, before we even get into the questions, where I think this question is going just based upon these facts. I initially thought this was going to be a question about anticipatory repudiation, based on the business's letter, basically admitting that they would not be able to perform on time. However, the facts here make it clear that this is actually a contract modification question, and that UCC/common law distinction I mentioned before is going to be central to our analysis. So the question prompts at the end of the essay key us in on the main two issues being tested. First, whether the modification of the service contract to repair the organ was valid at common law. And second, whether the modification of the contract for goods was valid under the UCC Article 2. What isn't as clear is the third issue prompted by these facts. See if you can listen back and identify it before moving on. But for now, let's move on to issue 1. The facts here make clear that the first issue being tested here is whether the modification of the service contract to repair the organ was valid at common law. So now that we know our issue, let's move on to our rule statement. The most important thing to keep in mind with rule statements is to start big picture and get more granular as you go. So here, we would start with a sentence like, a contract for services is generally governed by the rule of common law. Generally, a valid contract is formed where there exists 1. Mutual assent, meaning offer and acceptance, 2. Consideration, and 3. An absence of formation defenses. Consideration exists where there has been a bargain for exchange of legal detriment between the parties. Do you see how broken down that rule statement is? You have to think of these bar exam testers like they're little children and you're trying to explain the law to them on the most basic granular level. That'll help you nail and score the most points on these essay questions. Moving on. What common law rule is actually being tested here? That would be the pre-existing duty rule. The pre-existing duty rule provides that a promise to perform a pre-existing legal duty does not constitute consideration. This means that at common law, any agreement to modify the terms of a pre-existing duty must be supported by sufficient new consideration. The facts here indicate that no such consideration was provided between the business and the conservatory for the modifications in the service contract to repair the broken organ. The business already had a pre-existing duty to repair the organ and did not incur any legal detriment in exchange for the conservatory's promise to pay the additional $60,000. Even if the business would have promised to deliver the repaired organ in less time or offered any sort of indication that it was incurring some detriment as a result of the new agreement for the additional $60,000, that would have been sufficient to support this modification, as courts don't assess the adequacy of consideration. Next, we look to the exception of this rule. Namely, common law provides that a contract may be modified even in the absence of consideration if 1. The contract has not been fully performed on either side, 2. The modification is fair and equitable, and 3. The modification came in view of circumstances not anticipated at the time of contract formation. Let's dig into each of these one by one. First, the contract had not been fully performed by the business, as they had not yet prepared the organ. So we move on to the question of whether the modification of the contract was fair and equitable. Generally, the fair and equitable exception only applies in circumstances where the change in circumstances between the parties far exceeds the bounds of what was contemplated at contract formation, such that performance becomes impracticable. It's unlikely that the business simply running into financial difficulties would rise to this standard. Thus, the modification would be unlikely to be deemed fair and equitable. Finally, as for our last element, the facts here explicitly indicate that the financial difficulties suffered by the business were unanticipated, so that element would be satisfied. Given that this exception would fail on its second element, this modification was likely invalid and the business would be unlikely to recover the $60,000 for the modification to the repair contract. That brings us to issue 2, whether the business's modification of the contract for the sale of the new organ was valid. Once again, start big picture. Contracts for the sale of goods are governed by Article 2 of the UCC. An organ is likely a good. The central rule to remember for the second issue is that under Article 2, unlike at common law, an agreement to modify an existing contract does not require additional consideration in order to be binding. Under the UCC, modifications need only be made in good faith to be binding. Note that a modification is not made in good faith if it is made with the intention to circumvent the terms or obligations of the existing agreement without a legitimate commercial reason. Once again, the business's CFO's letter gives us all the facts we need here. The request to modify the contract was made in good faith because the business had suffered serious and unanticipated financial reversals. Thus, they had a legitimate commercial purpose for the modification. No consideration was required because this was a sale of goods contract. Therefore, the modification to the second contract was valid, and the business would be able to recover the $40,000 modification for the sale of the new organ. That brings us to our third and final issue. Did you figure it out? My discussion of the elements of a contract should have given you a clue. There is nothing here about formation, and we already covered consideration, so that leaves only defenses to formation. After a brief run-through of all the defenses to formation, one should have stood out to you above all. Duress. If the conservatory were found to be liable for the additional fees owed to the business, would it have a viable defense of duress? Don't feel bad if you missed this one. I missed it myself when I first run through this essay. The rule for duress applies to both common law and under the UCC, and makes void any contract in which a party's manifestation of assent is induced by either physical or economic threat. More specifically, here it appears we have a case of economic duress. Economic duress exists where a party's assent to a contract is induced by a threat which leaves the party no reasonable alternative. This is established by a showing of 1. A wrongful or improper, 2. Threat, 3. Which induced a manifestation of assent by a party, 4. And which the party would otherwise not have assented to if not for the gravity of the threat. Here, the business likely made a wrongful threat by communicating its inability to complete its obligation unless the conservatory agreed to make additional payments, as a conservatory stood to lose its considerable initial investment if it didn't pay the additional money. Further, it is unlikely that the conservatory would have agreed to pay the additional funds if it had any reasonable alternative but to pay up. With all that said, the business would have a strong defense to this claim, as the threat to breach a contract is generally insufficient to support an action for economic duress. Generally, economic duress must be established by more than a mere threat of breach to be actionable. Thus, this defense would be unlikely to apply for the very same reason that the conservatory would likely be liable for the $40,000 modification for the sale of the new organ. Based on these facts, the business's modification was not motivated by a bad faith attempt to extort a price increase from the conservatory, but instead by a good faith communication of the business's unforeseen financial difficulties. This concludes our Contracts Face Punch essay workshop. These contract essays can be foreboding, they can be difficult, but they're very doable. Once you sort of figure out how these essays work, you should have no problem tackling these and going into them confidently. That confidence should be the most important thing you take from these essay workshops. You're not always going to be confident that you're going to know the law on every essay. However, you should build the confidence in yourself to know that you can figure it out, and you can still get points even where you don't know every rule statement. And as long as you have that confidence and don't let the insidious doubt creep in, you'll be more than fine come exam day. If you have any questions about this module, Barcast, or anything in general, you can reach out to me directly at barcastaudio@gmail.com. That's barcastaudio@gmail.com. Till then, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye now.